What if I told you that there is a moral, ethical, and scientifically proven way to change the brains of people that you're talking to, such that they end up liking you, trusting you, and doing business with you? Imagine being able to do that. I mean, potential clients say, yes, I want to work with you instead of anyone else. Existing clients and team members say, yes, I believe that you actually understand me. Let's keep working together. Happy clients, happy advisors, happy team, happy business. But when most people hear about this scientifically proven way of changing people's brains such that they end up saying yes, most people respond in one of two ways. Number one, oh, that won't work for business. Or number two, that might work for some people, but that would never work for me. Well, keep listening, because I've been practicing these skills myself for over 40 years at this point. My advisor clients are doing it for themselves, and I'm about to show you how you can do it too. Welcome to Speaking of Numbers, the podcast where we empower accounting executives and advisors to go beyond the numbers to become confident, memorable communicators and thought leaders. When you do, you become the trusted expert in your field. You become the obvious choice for your clients, and you become the hero to yourself and to your team. My name is Jeff Bartsch. I spent 20 years in Hollywood shaping content for clients, including NBC, ABC, Disney, Apple, Netflix, and a whole bunch of others. In my time there, I realized that communication at the level for which Hollywood is known for doesn't just apply to movies and TV. Communication that stays in your heart and mind for years, maybe even sticking in there for your whole life, that kind of communication also applies to business. And it is a game changer when it does, especially in client advisory work that requires large amounts of trust. And here is the good news. That level of communication is not just for the privileged few. It comes from ideas that are available to anyone like you and I who seek them and apply them to their own life. And that's what I'm here to share with you in this limited edition podcast. So bear in mind, this is not a podcast where an episode drops every week for hundreds of episodes and you get buried in a mountain of information. These are a small number of pre-planned episodes with specific ideas that all build on each other. So make sure you start from the beginning so you can get all the ideas and the tools in the right order so you can start putting them to use for yourself. Imagine this. You are part of a scientific study and you lie down on a stretcher that places you inside a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, an fMRI scanner, a machine that actively measures the brain activity inside your head. As the test progresses, your brain activity starts to shift. The chemicals in your blood change. Your emotional state changes too. When the results of the test are published, you find out that you're not the only one who experienced those changes. Those same changes happen over and over again to people who went through that experiment. Same changes in brain activity, same changes in blood chemistry, same changes in emotion. It's as if the scientists were exercising some kind of mind control over their subjects. Here's what happened. Each time, the test subject listened to recordings of a story. Now, peer-reviewed studies combining story and brain science have been popping up everywhere over the last 20 years as brain scanning technology has improved. If you look up the phrase narrative transportation theory online, you'll find examples of studies like the one I just described. Now, good luck reading the actual papers themselves because those things are pretty dense. If you look up the phrase storytelling neuroscience, you'll find lots of details about exactly what happens in people's brains when they hear a story. Depending on the content of the story, the brain releases an entire cocktail of chemicals into the bloodstream. Things like cortisol, dopamine, oxytocin, all sorts of feel good or feel tense chemicals like that. And when that happens, it causes changes in people's bodies. Things like increased attention, sweating, changes in heart rate and breathing. Have you ever watched a really tense movie and you were sitting on the edge of your seat or holding your breath? That's because your brain was dumping cortisol into your bloodstream. Your heart started beating like crazy and you were becoming physically tense. And all of this means that people's emotions and mental state change too, whether it's a feeling of relief when the state of tension is resolved, or it's happiness for a character reaching their goal, or an entirely new way of seeing the world. Either way, people hear a collection of words arranged in what our brains recognize as a story structure, and we feel things. Squishy, undefined feelings and thoughts and all this kind of stuff happens just because we hear words. Now, we've all experienced this throughout our lives. We experience a well-told story and it sticks with us and it changes what we think or what we do. We've all experienced a story from an experienced speaker, and that story perfectly sets up the idea that the speaker goes on to talk about. And there are countless people out there who drop lines like, facts tell, but stories sell. Well, this is why. It is literally brain science. This stuff is hardwired into who we are as human beings. Uri Hasson is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University. He's one of those guys putting people inside brain scanners and telling them stories. He says, get this, storytelling has the power to synchronize brain activity between the storyteller and the audience. Basically, you can think of it as a form of mind control. And just like anything, it can be used to benefit others and it can be used to benefit yourself. So I'm going to assume that we're all on the same side here of using these tools to be of the greatest service possible to help our clients and our team get the things that they want. The point is, though, if your goal is to help someone to choose to work with you, to trust you, or to stay working with you, telling a well-crafted tactical story is a powerful tool to help you do exactly that. Now, at this point, I'm thinking about the responses you might be having to this. Maybe you're open to it and you're curious about how it works. Keep listening because we're getting there. But maybe you're just not into the idea at all. You may be thinking, Jeff, that was all well and good for scientists putting people inside brain scanners, but waving something like storytelling over business like a magic wand is a bit simplistic, and actually it's kind of naive. Getting clients and keeping clients and team members is way more involved than just telling stories. And to that I say, you're 100% right. Now, I didn't always think that. There were years when I looked at my career in Hollywood and saw people talking about storytelling in business, and I said, yes, storytelling is the magic wand, and I need to show people how to wave that magic wand for themselves and magically fix their businesses with the power of story. Wave the jazz hands. And here's the problem with that. For years, I had also been learning about business building and marketing, especially direct response B2C marketing, with all their formulas for irresistible headlines that grab your attention and force you to keep reading and hit that buy button. And a lot of times, they never told any stories at all. It was just sales copy. But man, it worked like crazy. And I sat there scratching my head, wondering how story was supposed to be the answer, but so much powerful communication drives business every minute of every day, and so much of it never tells a regular story at all. So is story the answer or not? The answer is yes, but not how I thought. Here is the extra mental shift that changed everything for me, and hopefully for you too. Now, I hope you've been listening to these episodes in order because everything builds on itself, as I've said earlier. And just like I talked in episode 2, talking about strategic story, most people don't realize that the concept of story exists at 2 levels, the strategic level and the tactical level. The strategic level of story is the big picture understanding of who the characters are, what they want, what's getting in their way, and what changes they want to see happen. Now, this can operate at the level of nations going to war. It can operate at the level of running a business of any scale, or it can go all the way down to the conversation inside one person's head. Strategic story explains it all, starting with the definition of what a story is. A character who wants something, overcomes obstacles to get it, and experiences transformation as a result. Now, this is the framework behind every human interaction at any time for any reason, period. But it's invisible. It's the big picture. And just like any other strategy, it has to show up in the world in some kind of tactical, practical way. Here's the kicker. Strategic story does not have to show up in the world as a tactical story, even though it sometimes does. Strategic story shows up at the tactical level in all sorts of different ways. Conversations, writing, speaking, wordless doing, you name it. And just like I talked about in episode 3, it can show up as symbols, attachments of meaning between surface level things and deeply held ideas or beliefs that already exist, or maybe you just create those meanings on purpose. The thing under the thing is one way strategic story shows up in a tactical way. This is why minds can change and businesses can run without anyone ever telling a typical story, the tactical version of storytelling that we all experience every day. Now, to be sure, tactical story is absolutely one of the ways that strategic story is put into action in the world. It's just one piece within an entire toolbox of communication tools that I'm laying out for you in all these episodes. Having said that, tactical story is a very, very powerful tool, especially when the lesson behind a tactical story points to the strategic story happening in the hearts and minds of its audience. Sometimes people get that, and the tactical story has a huge impact with its audience. I'm going to repeat that because this will directly affect the impact of any tactical story you ever tell. The power of any tactical story comes from when it points to the strategic story unfolding in the hearts and minds of its audience. This is why scientists telling a tactical story to the people lying flat on their backs in the fMRI machines cause mental and emotional changes. We think that the tactical story is what had the power, but that wasn't where it came from. The power from the story in those experiments came from the audience's reactions. I'll say it again. The test subjects' responses to the tactical story they heard lying in the brain scanner were driven by the strategic story in their own hearts and minds. Now, this is assuming that the story in any given situation will relate to its audience and that it's being told well, as in it's being told in a way that actually does connect with its audience. Unfortunately, a lot of the times we hear tactical stories that are told badly and it doesn't land with people. And we sit there and think, yeah, that was really kind of lame, which is why I could understand why people would think that story is kind of lame, except for the people who are experts. And it definitely doesn't have any kind of magic cure for business. So instead, let me offer this as a different way to think about it. Tactical stories are not magic wands that bring instant results. Think of them instead as a gradual tool that builds human connection. So, enough of the ideas. Let's get into some examples here. I once saw a story delivered by one of my clients on a video podcast. John Scott is a longtime partner and virtual CFO at Anders CPAs and Advisors. And he was part of a conversation where the co-hosts of the podcasts were talking about the importance of letting junior advisors be in the room for meetings with virtual CFOs and usually their CEO clients, because that's how they learn. You just wouldn't want to throw someone who's fresh out of college or still relatively young in their career. You wouldn't want to just throw them into a room and expect them to tell business leaders how to run their businesses when they've been doing it for years. So that's when John told the story about a time when he was that young guy getting thrown into the deep end of the pool. John told about the time when he was very early in his accounting career, just out of college, and he was working for a partner who was unable to review John's research one day before it had to be presented in a client meeting. And John had done the best that he knew how, but when he got up there and he presented his findings in the meetings, the CFO of the client said, I was a partner at a Big Four accounting firm for 20 years before I took on this position, and your answer is wrong. Even just talking about that, I mean, can you imagine what it must have been like to be in his shoes? And you should have seen the faces of the podcast co-hosts at that moment. Their mouths were hanging wide open. And so was mine. I was just sitting there. I was blown away. And at that moment, that tactical story from John built a connection between him and those co-hosts. They were amazed. They were all laughing. And because we've all been in situations where we're in over our heads or someone calls us out, it was a moment of we understand each other because we've been there and we've survived. So, was that story a magic wand that instantly built full-fledged relationships? No. Here's what it did do, though. It humanized John to anyone in the audience. It built instant rapport between him and the co-hosts, and the conversation continued. Tactical stories are not magic wands. They're not magic bullets, but they are incredibly powerful tools to build human connection layer by layer. So that's the first argument that people tend to have with the idea of putting tactical story into use. Here's the next response that usually comes up. Oh, telling stories is a special skill for special people talking to huge audiences, and I could never do that. Well, here's the truth about that. The best storytellers make it look easy, but it's not because they have unique, crazy, special skills that no one else have. They make it look easy because that's what expertise and mastery does. It rises above the details and the mechanics to create a unified impact that looks effortless. And the truth is, tactical storytelling ultimately boils down to skills, and skills can be learned, I promise. Now, before I tell you what those skills are, let me tell you about what you don't need. Now, in my early years of Hollywood, when I was on the story as a magic wand for everything stage, I was all about learning story structure like a screenwriter would use it in a movie or a TV show. Now, if you ask a Hollywood screenwriter how to tell a story, they'll get this crazy gleam in their eye, and they'll tell you that you need 87 plot points set up within a classic 3-act structure, and that everything has to be set up perfectly. And if you stick to the classic structure enough so that people understand it, that's good, but you always have to bring something unique to the story, otherwise the audience will get bored, blah, 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 blah. They'll go on and on and on with the details, and you'll sit there thinking, there's gotta be something simpler than this. Now, those screenwriters nerding out about 3-act structure aren't wrong. The reason they do need all those 87 plot points is because they're telling a long format story. They have to keep the audience's attention for an hour, 90 minutes, or 2 hours, sometimes longer, depending on what kind of movie you're doing. Thankfully, that's not what we need in business. Almost everything that we do in business is short form, which means story structure still needs to be present, but it's almost always simple. So here's how to do it. I'm going to lay out the steps, then show you how they apply to the story of my advisor client getting called out in the meeting way back in the day. Then I'll apply the ideas to another story that I crafted with another client. First, here are the ideas. Number 1, you need to know your audience, know your context, know your desired goal, know the things under the thing, and then you need to build the story around specifics. So those are the 5 things, and now I'm going to explain all of them here. So number 1, you need to know your audience. Anytime you tell any tactical story, you need to remember where the power comes from. Like we talked in episode 2, the power comes from the strategic, big picture story coming out of the lives of your audience. And like we talked in episode 3, when we use our communication to talk to the things that your audience already cares about, their things under the thing, they feel an emotional connection to you and to me. So, because all the power lies with the audience, you need to get really clear on who they are, what they want, what's keeping them from getting it, and how you can help them get what they want. I mean, I literally sat down and answered those questions while putting this episode together of this podcast. I eat my own cooking, folks. So once you have the answers to those questions, then you shape your tactical story in reverse. You need to start with the context or deliverable. Where are you? Are you telling a story one-on-one with a one-on-one conversation in person? Are you introducing yourself on a webinar or a business podcast? Are you setting up an idea and a presentation? In my client's case, in John's case, he was in a conversation on a business accounting podcast where the co-hosts were talking about the need for younger team members to learn how business works with clients before throwing them into the deep end and risking them falling flat on their face. So John told a story that supported that conversation about a time when he was a young team member and he did fall flat on his face. Knowing where you are and what you're doing is the first step. Once you know that, you figure out what is your goal or desired result. Now, if you're fans of Stephen Covey, this is the idea of begin with the end in mind, build in reverse. But here's the thing. It's tempting to say that figure out your end goal of the story should be the first thing here too. But even Covey didn't do that when he described begin with the end in mind in his books or presentations, because he always set the context first. Usually he did that by setting up a scenario where you eventually figure out that you're looking at yourself at your own funeral. That is the context that raises the conversation to the scale of, okay, so what do you want to have accomplished by the end of your life? That's the context from which Covey always said, begin with the end in mind. Thankfully, we don't have to go that big of a picture of a scale here. When you're telling a story, your goal will be way more achievable when you keep your goal contained. Don't try to use a tactical story to accomplish something big like, I want to move a first-time conversation into immediately closing a huge contract. That'll be trying to do too much at once. Tactical stories are the most effective when they accomplish one thing in light of what your audience actually cares about. In John's case, telling his story on the podcast, he pretty much just did this automatically. We do it all the time when we think, okay, here's what people are talking about in the conversation, so I'll tell a story so I can support that idea. If you look at it from the bigger picture, though, you might look at his goal like this. I'm on a business podcast. The hosts are discussing a topic that I have personal experience with. My goal here is to let the co-hosts and audience know that I've been in that position myself, and hopefully they'll feel an extra level of connection that will help the conversation continue. That's a way that you could position that if you were building this from scratch beforehand. Now, again, he probably didn't think about anything like that in the moment, but that's a way that you can intentionally craft that to happen for yourself on purpose. So you're wanting to tell a tactical story. You know your audience, you know your context, you've defined your specific focused goal. Next, figure out, what does the audience care about? That's all about episode 2. What is the story unfolding in the audience's own hearts and minds? And episode 3, what are the things under the thing that they really care about? Now, in John's case, his story about getting called out by the client is absolutely hammering on some primal level things under the thing that the co-hosts and the audience could definitely relate to. Things like inexperience. At some point, we all have to start from zero. And a lot of the time, we're doing our best, but we just don't know what we don't know. Taking a risk is another element here. It took guts for John to present his research without it being reviewed by his partner, but that was a job, so he did the best we could. We've all been in a situation where we're putting ourselves out there and we're just crossing our fingers that everything goes okay. And then there's the idea of imposter syndrome and public humiliation. Man, anytime you grow or you stretch yourself into something new, there is a very good chance that somewhere in your head, there's going to be a voice saying something to the effect of, who do you think you are that you could do something like that? Because let's face it, someone, somewhere is going to find out that you don't know what you're doing and that you are a fraud. And if we let it, that voice can go around in circles. Thankfully, we don't usually end up getting called out, but John's story told of a time when that worst case scenario did happen. And man, was it brutal. But then, here's the good news. That worst case scenario is what provides the power to the story. Because in any story, the bigger the problem, the more valuable the solution is. Which brings me to another thing under the thing, the idea of learning from hard things. The lowest low makes that journey onto the other side all that more rewarding. And John didn't even really have to say anything about that because it's referring to a time that happened a long time ago and everyone can look back at it and laugh. And John obviously didn't shrivel up and die. He survived and he learned from it. And now he's a longtime partner at a top 100 accounting firm. These are some of the elements in play that made everyone's jaws drop when John told that story. And that's what happens when you connect to things under the thing. In this case, fears that people have that they don't have to experience themselves, which means they feel empathy and connection with John for the fact that he did go through that experience. So, when you're crafting a tactical story, you need to know your audience, know your context, know your goal or your desired outcome. You need to know your things under the thing. And once you know that, you need to build your story around specifics. Now, this is where Hollywood screenwriters would say, you need to use 3-act structure with 87 plot points. Or other people would say, you need to use The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. Or you need to use the 7-step story brand framework by Donald Miller. Now, all of these story frameworks are excellent in their own context. They all accomplish the same thing, and they all have their own place. But all those frameworks are, to one extent or another, complicated. So to help you actually accomplish building a tactical story that creates genuine impact with your audience, you need to keep things very simple and specific. And the ideas that follow here are based on a framework by corporate story strategist Kindra Hall from her book, Stories That Stick. Phenomenal book. And her framework focuses around building around these specific things: a specific moment, a specific character, specific details, genuine emotion, and sometimes I will add a specific lesson or parallel to get you from your story into the rest of what you're doing. And I'll explain those right now. So in Stories That Stick, Kindra Hall goes into all the science of why specifics are important, which in a nutshell, if things are too broad, our brains don't connect on an emotional level. But when we get specific, our brains are far more likely to move into that state of narrative transportation I mentioned earlier in this episode. It's the scientific way of saying getting sucked into the story. And it happens when we focus on specific elements. So, a specific moment. Now, if this was a movie or a TV show, we would have dozens of moments. But here, for the purposes of us building a tactical story that you can actually use, we're talking about one moment. That's it. You need to talk about life before the moment itself, and then life after the moment. And there will almost always be some kind of change in that process. Now, for John's story, it all centers around the moment when he got called out by the client. He sets the context, life before, by saying that he was young in his career, his managing partner didn't have the chance to check out his work, he delivers the presentation, and boom, that moment, the client calls him out. He wants to crawl into a hole in the ground, and the audience's jaw is on the floor. Now, the story actually doesn't have to do much after that, because of the greater context of where John was telling that story. It was a personal example of don't throw the young team members into the deep end with a client. Obviously, he learned from the experience, he survived, everyone can laugh at it now and move on. But the framework of that story is built around one specific moment of being called out by the client. So, the next thing is a specific character. To connect emotionally, a story needs to be about one person, not a group of people. It's been said that 1,000 people dying is a statistic, but one person dying is a tragedy. And the reason that is having one specific character means that an audience has more chance to identify personally with that one character. Now, in John's case, it was based around his own experience. He was the character. And all of us have experienced what it was like to just be starting out in our professional roles, maybe getting in over our heads at some point or doing everything possible to not get there. Now, if the story had been about a group of tax accountants all falling short of client expectations, guaranteed that story wouldn't land like it does for just one guy to get blown out of the water by a client. Next, specific details. Details are what help the story to feel real. Sometimes that comes from describing a certain object, a color, or a specific thing on the wall, or the carpet that you're walking on, or maybe it's making a note of the specific time of the day. In this case, the biggest detail from John's story comes from the direct quote from the client. The next thing you need is genuine emotion. For a tactical story to connect with an audience, it needs to have genuine human emotion. And it doesn't have to be anything extreme either. It just needs to exist. Now, in John's story, the emotion was extreme. It was nervousness going into the meeting and then the complete humiliation during the meeting. Also, I will say the surprise element. Normally, a business context isn't just going to completely crush you like that. It's not just going to completely sideswipe you. But again, depending on your goal, you don't need that extreme emotion. It can be something as simple as, I don't know how to do this on my own and I need someone to help. The last element for a tactical story that lands, depending on your context and your goal, you often need one specific lesson or parallel to transition out of your story into the rest of what you're doing. Now, for John's story, he did mention that when he went back to his partner, he said, I don't know what I did wrong, and that he learned from the experience. And the co-hosts picked up the conversation from there. Now, if John was telling that story in a solo context after talking about the moment, he could say something to the effect of, even though I wanted to crawl into a hole in the ground, I survived. But how many times do we as leaders do that to our people without knowing it? Or whatever lesson or point that he wants to make. Whatever you say after a story, though, the meaning of the story needs to point toward the meaning you want to make after it. That's the most powerful function of a tactical story, to engage an audience by pointing to a deeper truth that you expand later. So, to review, in order to legally and ethically control the minds of your audience through the use of tactical storytelling so that they pay attention to you, feel a connection to you, and say yes to you and your business, you need to begin with foundational knowledge. You need to know your audience, who they are, what they want, what's keeping them from getting it, and what change they want to see, and how you can help them get what they want. You need to know your context or deliverable. Is it a solo presentation, one-on-one conversation? Is it a group context? You need to know your desired goal. Don't try to set the world on fire with just one story. Keep your goal manageable. Then know the things under the things that your audience cares deeply about. Once you have that foundational knowledge, you need to craft your story around specific elements, a specific moment, a specific character, specific details, genuine emotion, and sometimes a lesson or a parallel to get you from your story into the rest of what you're thinking. Now, it is possible at this point you're thinking, okay, Jeff, this sounds like a lot of steps and it sounds really complicated. I thought you said this was going to be simple. And the fact of the matter is, this is the simple version. It's really hard to accomplish human connection without having these kind of elements all working at once. Remember what I said earlier about the screenwriter types who all say that you need 87 plot points? That's the crazy version. And the more ingredients you throw into the recipe, the more chances you have for things to not work. With this version here, You do your homework, you set the stage, you talk about one moment, not 7, not 15, and definitely not 87. When you do it right, everything just works. And people have this internal reaction that they know that it's powerful, but it's really hard to put numbers onto it. It's squishy, it's undefined. And so they say things like, oh, that's a powerful story. Or you're such a great storyteller. You have such a gift. I'm telling you, it's not a gift. It is based on ideas and skills that I've been laying out for you right here. Having said that, if you want to bake an amazing cake, the baker needs to know the ingredients and the process in order for things to happen the way that they need to. You're also going to be better off if you work with a baker who knows what not to put in the cake, because they've baked a whole bunch of them, including cakes that have not worked. So if you already know right now that you have a story that you need to tell, and you need it to land in an impactful way for your clients, to your team, or to your audience, and you want guidance in how to make that happen, that is one of the things that I do for my advisory clients. If you'd like to have a conversation about working directly with me to shape that story for you, send an email to hello@storygreenlight.com. Now, as I promised, I told you about the specifics of how to put a tactical story together. I explained John's story in light of them, and now I'm going to apply those from scratch to a story from another client of mine. Now, in this story, I've changed some details for client privacy, but the context and the story itself is still the same. So my client, Jared, is an advisor with a background in sales, operations, and management in multiple Fortune 500 companies. He has extensive experience as well within the accounting advisory space, and I was brought in to help him build a customized thought leadership presentation to be given to owners of digital agency company owners who would be potential clients for advisory services. Now, the body of the presentation was mostly built, but it needed to have Jared's own specific stories woven into it, especially one that introduced him at the very beginning. So I sat down with him and we started laying out the groundwork for his opening story, just like I've been talking about in this episode here. Know your audience, know your context, know your desired goal, know the things under the thing, and then build story around specifics. So in this case, the audience is digital agency owners with annual revenues between $2 million and $30 million who don't have an in-house CFO, but they need to level up their financial game. The context is an hour-long live online webinar where Jared would be the guest expert along with a host who would facilitate the webinar and add commentary along the way. And for our purposes here, the specific context was Jared's opening story about his background. Then, know your goal and desired outcome. Unlike John's story that left people with their jaws on the floor in the moment, this was not the time for anything crazy or emotional. The goal is to let the audience know that Jared knows what he's talking about, that he understands where they are, and that the content to come is going to be worth their time. Then, the things under the thing. Jared already has regular conversations with these agency owners. So I started asking him about the concerns that they usually mention when they talk with him. A lot of things came up, and we started distilling those conversation subjects into core ideas and themes like self-doubt, being in over your head, and looking for reassurance. So we had the groundwork laid for his tactical story. We knew the audience, the context, the goal, and the things under the thing for the audience. The next step in reverse engineering was to pick a specific story from his background that illustrated those things under the thing and craft the story around specifics. A specific moment, specific character, specific details, genuine emotion, and in this case, we did want a specific lesson or a parallel to get from the story into the rest of the presentation. So I asked Jared about any specific times that he could remember being in over his head or needing reassurance that's in his own background. He thought for a bit and he came up with a couple options, and we settled on one where he had needed some financial answers in a management role. He'd reached out for help and he'd gotten those answers from a financial expert that he trusted. Now, before I tell you that story, remember that we didn't pick this story from the beginning out of thin air. That's where a lot of people go wrong when they try to tell a story. They say, what story could I tell that will land powerfully with my audience? They then end up drowning in an entire lifetime of source material and they give up. Or they tell a story that could be powerful, but the story doesn't fit the context, so it still flops. To tell a story that lands with your audience, don't start with the story itself. You work backwards. Figure out the emotional elements you need to hit. Figure out the lessons that you want people to learn, and only then pick out a story that demonstrates the lesson that you've already picked out. In this case, Jared's task was to tell a story to business owners who are responsible for answers that they don't have on their own. And they're watching a webinar from someone who's offering them financial insight with the potential of becoming their ongoing paid financial advisors. So Jared remembered a time in his own life when he was in that exact position that his current audience members were in, which meant that the lesson from his story would apply directly to the story unfolding real time in the lives of his audience members. So, keeping all these elements in mind, I drafted Jared's introduction story for the purpose of introducing who he is, letting the audience know that he understands them, and that the presentation would be worth their time. That story goes like this. So the webinar host says, that's a little bit about us and what we do. And now to talk about how that actually happens, I'm going to turn things over to our guest expert for today. Take it away, Jared. To which he says, thanks. My name is Jared, and in my role here, I have a lot of interactions with digital agency owners who've gotten to a point where their business is growing, but they have questions that they don't know how to answer by themselves, especially when it comes to financial questions. And I will say, I've been in that place myself. I've lived lots of different lives over my career. I've held positions of leadership and management in multiple Fortune 500 companies. There's a good section of my career when I was at Procter & Gamble in different operations and management positions. And there were times when I was over my head financially in those operations roles. I mean, I had full P&L responsibility, but there was a lot that I didn't know about connecting operations, which I did have a good handle on. I didn't know how to connect operations to all those numbers, and especially when it came to forecasting numbers into the future. And it came to the point where I knew I just had to get some help. Thankfully, we had a really great controller on our team, and I started reaching out to him when I had questions. And it turned out he was really wanting to learn more about the bigger picture of the plant that I was managing. So we started going out to lunch together and comparing notes over lunch. People actually started kind of looking at us funny because they were surprised that I was hanging out with the nerdy controller guy. But he was such an important part of our team because even though I was responsible, he knew how to explain the numbers when I couldn't. That's what we do every day here. And that's what I want to dig into with you over the next few minutes here. And the conversation goes on from there. So, are there any emotional bombs going off? Nope, didn't need to. It was an actual example from his own career so that he could deliver it genuinely. It was built for the specific purpose of saying to his audience, I know you feel the weight of being responsible for numbers and answers that you don't know how to give. I've been there myself. That's what we do here, and I'm here to show you the way forward with this presentation. Now, was that story a magic wand to wave over his audience and they instantly sign six-figure contracts? No. Communication is not that simple, and neither is business. But I would bet actual money that if you had slid Jared into an fMRI scanner at that moment, measured his brain activity, and compared it to the brain activity of his audience members, you would have seen the audience's brain waves changing to match Jared's, just like he was pulling off some kind of mind control. And as a result, those audience members end up thinking, this guy sounds legit. And for some reason, I actually really like him. Let's see what he has to say. And that, my friend, is just one example of what tactical storytelling can do for business. Over this episode, I've been laying out the ideas for how to apply all the undefined squishiness of communication theory into the tool of tactical storytelling to help you accomplish specific results in business. Maybe at this point, this is all that you need for what you're looking to accomplish. If so, awesome. Take the ideas and run with them. And maybe you know that we all achieve even greater things by bringing in the expertise of others to support what we're already doing. Maybe, for instance, you know a general knowledge of woodworking tools, but you know that you'll be far happier with the results of working with a master craftsman who not only knows the tools, but knows how to use them and also knows when not to use them when it comes to building something that does exactly what you're looking for. If that's where you are right now and you want to explore the possibility of working directly with me to put these ideas into use for you or your team, the best way to do that is to experience the ideas in a personalized way for yourself. To apply for a complimentary coaching session with me with zero obligation to become a paying client, send me an email to hello@storygreenlight.com and mention the complimentary coaching session that you heard about on this podcast. Email me again at hello@storygreenlight.com to apply for a personalized experience putting these ideas into play for yourself. And make sure to check out the next episode where I dig into an incredibly powerful tool that will explain any idea and increase your influence on anyone. I'm Jeff Barch, and that's what's happening on the next episode of Speaking of Numbers.